Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Fronteras, a Changing America. I'm Anthony Morneau. Some voters participating in local elections in Las Cruces this fall will take part in ranked choice voting. Here to share more about ranked choice voting is Maria Perez, co-director with Democracy Rising. Thank you so much for joining us, Maria.
Good morning, Anthony. Thanks for having me.
Could you share with our audience a little bit about your organization and what its mission is?
Certainly. Democracy Rising, it's a very small organization. There's only two of us in it. We our mission really is to advance democracy, to create a democracy where everyone it has representation and where everybody who wants to run for office is able to do so and has a chance to be a viable candidate. And finally, we believe in a democracy where elected officials can be held accountable by the voters. So we're just trying to create a stronger democracy in communities across the country. We work in many different states. I'm based in Santa Fe, New Mexico, so we're doing a little bit of work here in New Mexico at this time since this election cycle is coming up.
I saw that you were able to do some candidate training and training for folks interested in voting in the Las Cruces City Council elections. You were able to give a little bit of a tutorial on ranked choice voting, and I know you've done some extensive work educating folks on ranked choice voting with your organization. I'd like to hear from you and for our audience members at home who might not be familiar with ranked choice voting, if you could give them a basic understanding of what we're looking at with ranked choice voting.
Sure. Ranked choice voting basically is a different way of doing elections, where as a voter, when you look at your ballot, when you have your ballot, as a voter, you have the opportunity to rank the candidates running for a race in order of preference instead of just choosing one and hoping that everybody else loses, right? You're able to give a little bit more nuance about which candidate you like, which candidate you might like a little bit less, but still would prefer than somebody else on the race. So for a voter, basically, you just get a ballot that has the name of the candidates, and you're able to rank them in order of preference.
So when is ranked choice voting triggered in an election race?
So ranked choice voting is the way that elections are ran in Las Cruces for municipal elections and also in Santa Fe. And a race needs to have more than two candidates for ranked choice voting to be triggered. So in Las Cruces right now, there's 3 city council races, and only one of those races has more than 2 candidates. I believe it's District 5, and there's 4 candidates, I think. So that if you live in that district, you will have a ranked ballot. But for the other ones, there's only 2 candidates, so that there's no ranked choice voting in those races, because by definition, if there's 2 candidates, you're going to get one of those candidates winning with a majority of the votes.
Well, what about if there is a write-in candidate in the District 3 race? We have a situation where there may be ranked choice voting as well with a write-in candidate. Can you explain what we're looking at with that issue?
If there's a write-in candidate, then yes, the ranked choice voting, the ranked choice tabulation would be triggered.
Okay. So can you kind of give us a little bit of understanding about what happens when we have ranked choice voting and we have a plethora of candidates to choose from? When there's many candidates running in the race, we often see this in presidential elections where we have many folks running in primaries. How do you think ranked choice voting can really make a difference in helping with perhaps shortening primaries and helping out voters and keeping a lot of money and influence out of politics?
Boy, there's a lot of parts to that question.
Yeah, let's start off with just shortening our choices and making it easier with primaries.
So that's a really interesting way to do primaries, right? In this last presidential election, there were 4 states there are 5 states really who used a ranked ballot to do their Democratic primaries, right? And I worked in 4 of those states doing voter education. And those states were Alaska, Hawaii, Kansas, and Wyoming. So, I mean, this is states that had a party caucus system before, and ranked choice voting is basically like a caucus system, right? You get to sit with a candidate you love, and if that candidate doesn't seem to be viable, then you're able to sort of like go to the candidate that maybe is your second preference if that candidate is more viable. So it was a great way of doing primaries, Democratic primaries for those states. They saw, good voter turnout. They saw that voters understood what was asked of them. But again, it's kind of like similar to a traditional caucus system, which is very different than what happens in municipal elections, right? If you, in the state of New Mexico, if you have a ranked choice voting election, you can rank up to 10 candidates. If you'll remember, the last mayoral election a couple years ago in Las Cruces, there were 10 candidates running for mayor, and folks were able to rank as many of them as they wanted to. You can rank just one, or you can rank 2, 3, 4, as many candidates as you actually have a positive opinion of on your ballot. It's, somebody was talking about this to me yesterday, where they described ranked choice voting sort of like a way to compare candidates. She likened it to the process of maybe getting an apartment or getting a job. You apply to a bunch of them, and there's things that you like about each one. There's things that maybe you don't like about each one, but you weigh your choices and you have a favorite. And if you don't get that one, you have a plan B. And if you don't get that one, you get a plan C. And that's how you narrow your choices down with a system like ranked choice voting.
We saw some complaints with ranked choice voting in the election in New York recently. Can you kind of talk with us a little bit about what you think went wrong with that election, and why you think ranked choice voting is still a viable choice in that situation?
So yeah, that was an interesting thing in New York City. They used it for their primary elections, right, at the municipal level. New York City is huge. Of course, there's millions of voters. There was over 35 candidates, I believe, on the ballot for for different races. And what went wrong in New York was that it had nothing really to do with the system itself, with ranked choice voting. What happened was that the Board of Elections, which is the entity that's in charge of counting the votes, before you tabulate any election, you do a test run just to make sure that the machines are working, that things are running smoothly. So you do a test run, you put some test ballots into the machine, and you know what you're putting in, and you see what the tabulator comes up with. You make sure that it's the same as you were expecting. You make sure that the machines were working. That's what happened in New York. They did this test run, and then they forgot to take those test ballots out. So it was a mess, right? They had I believe a few thousand ballots that were not real ballots, and then they had to backtrack and take those ballots out and only count the actual ballots that were provided by the voters. It didn't have anything to do with a ranked ballot. The voters actually, there's an exit poll that was done for voter satisfaction with the system, right? It was the first time that New York used it. And over 80% of the voters across demographics, they talk to Latino voters, to African American voters, to Asian American voters, and so forth. And also across age demographics, right? Older voters, younger voters. Over 80% of them, in general, found the system to be intuitive and easy to use. So in a way, that ranked choice voting election in New York was very successful. The city council now, for the first time ever, is majority women, majority people of color. That really represents actually what New York City looks like. But yeah, that kink, right, in the plan with the Board of Elections was an unfortunate thing that happened, because it just gave the whole election sort of like a sour flavor that people, and for good reason, feel not super confident about.
So when there is a move to ranked choice voting, do you think it's a good idea for clerks at the city or county level to invest in more staff and personnel if possible?
Absolutely, and Doña Ana County has done a great job at this, right? They're well staffed. They trained their poll workers really well. They ran a really good ranked choice voting election. They administered it very well the last time around. It really pays to particularly train your poll workers, right? Because if there's any voter confusion, if voters have any questions, those poll workers are a lifeline for voters to get correct information, to get succinct information when they're at the polls. But beyond that, right, it's about the staffing of whoever's going to administer the election. In Las Cruces, right, it's the county of Doña Ana, the clerk, that's going to be administering the election, her and her staff. But besides that, right, like it's really important that voters know that ranked choice voting, that the voting machines that are used are the same that we use for all elections, that these machines are state certified by the Secretary of State. They're federally certified by federal agency that do that kind of things. That ranked choice voting elections can be audited like any other election. We have a paper ballot, right, in New Mexico, so any election, be it ranked choice voting or not, can be audited. Those ballots can be looked at if there's any questions. So there's really no reason for voters to be nervous about the system as a system itself. It works perfectly, just like the more traditional way. It's counted by the same machines, and as a voter, you should have confidence that your county election administrators are going to do a great job, and that your ballot is going to count the way that you mean it to be counted.
There's been a lot of criticism with elections, especially primary elections, that are closed, that they're not really getting the full voice of all of the voters. With ranked choice voting being involved in primary elections, do you think that this kind of goes against the premise of ranked choice voting? What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, there's a lot of people having this conversation around the country, right? There's, like I said, there's some states that did their primaries, their party primaries, using ranked choice voting. Of course, that still can be just close to those parties' voters, right? If the Democratic Party is doing a ranked choice voting election and it's a closed primary, only Democratic voters who are registered as Democrats can vote in that election. Some other states are looking at doing sort of like an open primary with ranked choice voting, right? Where like all the candidates from all the different parties can just run on one ticket, and then the top, say, 4 vote getters or 5 vote getters then go to a ranked choice voting election where a majority winner can be determined. And that's a way where some people are thinking maybe that's a way to open primary so that all the voters can go and vote for all the candidates and float those candidates that have the broadest level of support to that ranked choice voting election that would be more the general that determines who the actual winner is.
Over the last 2 presidential elections, some voters have expressed frustration with our voting system and our political system in general, saying that money has really taken over politics and lobbyists. How do you feel that ranked choice voting can make an impact and ensure voters that their vote is truly their voice?
The problem with money, big money in politics and in elections is huge, right? This is one of the existential problems to our democracy. Ranked choice voting does not solve that problem, but it can mitigate it a little bit. I'll give you an example at the local level, right? In the city of Minneapolis in Minnesota, they use ranked choice voting. And a few cycles ago, there was a race where for a city council seat where the incumbent was the president of the council. She'd served there for multiple terms. Her dad had served on the governing body for multiple terms, sort of like a dynasty family in that governing body. And she had a lot of money. And she spent all that money on TV ads, attacking her opponents, on mailers, sort of like that kind of like traditional way of running campaigns. One of her opponents was a young organizer of color in the community, and he barely had any money, but he used all the funds he had to go door knocking in his district. He reached every door in his district at least twice. He talked to most of the voters, and that's the way that he spent his money, right? So he had less than a tenth of the budget that the incumbent did, but he spent it actually connecting with voters, talking to voters, finding out what voters care about, getting those second and third choice votes from voters who preferred another candidate. And when it was all said and done, he won, right? He defeated the incumbent. So ranked choice voting can sort of mitigate the influence of money in politics, because as a system, ranked choice voting incentivizes candidates talking to voters, which is a lot less expensive than TV ads or running, negative billboards and things like that. So it's a mitigating factor, but we see in ranked choice voting elections all over the country where there's just the candidates that have a lot of financial backing from big PACs, and it's a very difficult thing to counteract just with a ranked ballot, right? That needs to be reformed at a different level.
There's been a lot of criticism about only having two candidates to choose from in a lot of elections. Do you think ranked choice voting can open the door for more third-party candidates to have a greater chance of winning?
Yes, I mean, we have, in my opinion, we do have a problem with having a two-party system, right, in this country where many of our elections, especially outside of the municipal level, right, most of our state and federal elections come down to two candidates. And those candidates have been vetted through this primary process that, like you mentioned, Anthony, leave out a lot of voters, right? So just a small segment of the voters who are registered with a party can choose those people that actually are going to be voted on in the general. I think ranked choice voting, we see it at the municipal level, right? Those are usually nonpartisan elections, so we don't have to worry about the primary. We don't have to worry about having, one Democrat versus one Republican. At the municipal level, in places that have ranked choice voting, we do see that it incentivizes more candidates to run, to throw their hat in the race and see if they're viable, right? Because in a system like ranked choice voting, you get rid of that spoiler effect, which means, candidates are not told to drop from the race because they're going to help somebody get elected. They're not told to wait their turn. You're not going to help elect somebody you really don't like if you participated as a candidate in an election. So the incentive to drop out is not there. The incentive to just let the two main, most viable, most well-known, most moneyed candidates run and then everybody drop out is not an incentive in ranked choice voting. So we see more candidates running, right? In Las Cruces, there were 10 candidates running for mayor last time, as opposed to, usually there isn't that. It's just a couple of candidates. In Santa Fe, we saw 5 candidates for mayor. The last cycle, we have 3 this cycle. So, yes, third party, but at the local level where elections are nonpartisan, I think it just opens the door for non-traditional candidates, right? Younger candidates who are community leaders and not particularly politicians, candidates who don't have a party machine behind them to fund their campaigns. Everybody can run and share their vision for their community and see what happens.
How do you think ranked choice voting can ensure voters that the elections are secure? Can it help with voter security in just knowing that their elections are secure? I mean, we've seen recently many candidates, if they lose, especially if they lose, have voiced that the election, there was fraud going on in the election. We've seen this in recent years, even at the highest level. So I'd like to hear from you, how do you think ranked choice voting can ensure secure elections?
I mean, like I mentioned before, Anthony, I don't think that there's anything specific about ranked choice voting that makes an election more or less secure. Election security really has to do with a number of things, right? One is those voting machines being certified and tested, right? That they work, that they tabulate the way they're supposed to. Of course, voting machines are not, they're insular, they're not connected to the internet, they're not hackable, right? Also in New Mexico, like I mentioned, we have a paper ballot so that every single vote can be traced down to an actual physical ballot. So if there needs to be a recount, if there needs to be an audit, those are the things that really ensure a secure election. And whether it's ranked choice voting or not, in New Mexico, I really would like your audience to know that we have great systems in place for election security in terms of the voting machines, in terms of systems and procedures for audits, and also just having a paper ballot. So ranked choice voting doesn't make a difference either way. It doesn't make an election more or less secure. But in New Mexico, whether you have a ranked choice voting election or not, you can feel pretty certain that the election is going to be secure and that your vote is going to be counted as you intended it to be counted.
I want to move on and talk about some criticism of ranked choice voting, though. Harvey Mansfield, a Harvard government professor, wrote an opinion piece in the Wall Street Journal this summer criticizing ranked choice voting. I want to talk with you about some of his thoughts. One of them was that ranked choice voting requires the voter to divide their vote, perhaps putting the individual above the so-called common good in elections. What are your thoughts on this?
So another thing that I want to make sure your audience understands is that ranked choice voting, you don't get to divide a vote, and you don't get multiple votes, right? As a voter, you just get one vote. It's just that you give your vote to your favorite candidate, and then you identify on your ballot who your backups are in case your favorite candidate drops out, isn't viable, doesn't have enough popular support to be a viable candidate. So I don't agree with that criticism, because as a voter who has voted in a ranked choice voting election, my feel is I really love this candidate. I know that they can't win, but I want to give them my support because I think it's important that as a community, we know how many people actually support this candidate's platform, vision for the community. So on my first ranked choice voting election that I voted in Santa Fe, I voted for my favorite candidate. They weren't a viable candidate. They got eliminated after a couple of rounds. My vote then went to my next choice on my ballot, which felt great because I didn't have to feel like I'll just vote for who I really love, and I know that my vote will be wasted because they're not a viable candidate. They got eliminated. They were not a viable candidate. My vote then went to my next preferred candidate, and that felt really good. In the end, the mayor who got elected was marked on my ballot as one of my backup choices. And even though they weren't my favorite, I felt pretty content as a voter that my vote was still counted. I still had I still participated. My vote was still in play and still got to elect the person who ultimately served as my mayor.
Mr. Mansfield also brought up that coalitions are also needed to win elections, and they're also formed usually during the campaign season while folks are running. Do you think ranked choice voting could impact that process of coalitions being formed before the election, perhaps impacting the election? What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, I absolutely think so. And this is one of my favorite things about ranked choice voting is that it incentivizes candidates to see about ways to work together, see about things that they actually agree on, and form coalitions around those policy platforms rather than attack each other all the time. So we see, not in every ranked choice voting election, each one is different because having to do with who's running. But many times in ranked choice voting elections, we see where there's maybe 2 or 3 candidates that have somewhat similar platforms, right? Going back to the point about how ranked choice voting kind of like gets rid of that split vote situation, right? You have 2 or 3 candidates that have similar ideas, similar platforms. Instead of attacking each other and trying to steal votes from each other because they're kind of like fighting for the same pool of voters, they can form a coalition and sort of campaign together even and say, vote for me as your number 1 candidate and vote for them as your number 2 candidate, right? And people can cross campaign in that way with that similar message. So coalitions are a big part of running a successful ranked choice voting campaign. We talk about this in those candidate trainings that you mentioned. How do you forge connection, right, with your opponents? I don't even like to talk about opponents in a ranked choice voting race. I talk about a cohort, right? There's a group of people running. Who's similar, who's different, and which ways do they agree and which ways do they not? In ranked choice voting elections, often we also see that whoever wins then appoints their opponents to different posts because they had campaigned together on a number of issues. So I like that a lot, right? Because even if my candidate didn't win, maybe they'll get appointed to run a certain department or to work on a certain issue that's important to me and my community.
Okay, unfortunately, Maria, we are out of time for this conversation, but I want to thank you so much for joining us. Maria Perez is co-director with Democracy Rising. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We want to thank you for joining us for another episode of Fronteras, A Changing America. I'm Anthony Morneau. We'll see you next time.